Hello everyone, my name is Mateo Sanchez, and in this video I would like to share uh, my mind map that is based on one of my constructs of my thesis project. So let's start. The construct is bilingualism, and I decided like to divide this construct into four main aspects. So the first one is who is bilingual based on these authors. The second one is what, uh, what is bilingualism based on Mackay 1962, and that is very connected with this idea of who is bilingual. The next one is types and distinctions of bilingualism. And the last one is what types of bilingual education exist. So let's start with who is bilingual. So the first author that I found was Baker 2001, and he argues that defining who is or is not bilingual is completely complex and actually impossible. So why? He mentions and he declares that it is very difficult to defining who is bilingual. Why? Because he consider that there are many aspects to take into account when defining it. Uh, Either context, age, or how you become bilingual. So for for his perspective, it is very difficult like to define or to set a definition of what a person can be considered as a bilingual. Okay, the next one is also Baker, but in this case with Singwix 2000, and they state that an individual develops better one and more potent what language than the another one. Why? Because they consider that as there are many aspects, one of those like the context, it influences uh, in the use of one language and the another one. So for that reason, they consider that the individual it's gonna be uh, more likely to use and to develop a better one language than the another one. The next one says whether one is considering it at a societal or an individual level, one has to accept that there can be no clear cutoff points. Hoffman, 1991. What she wanted to say with this quote is basically that some authors uh, develop their ideas based on the on societal and individual level, but they don't consider the other aspects that can influence on the develop of the concept or the idea. So this idea is really connected with the first one about uh, defining who is or who is not bilingual. It's quite impossible because there are many aspects to consider. And finally, Titon 1976 explains that a bilingual person has the ability to communicate in any of both languages spontaneously. His idea can be connected with the idea of Baker and Singwix in the way that both of them mention that you can like communicate or use one language more than the another one, or in case of Titon that maybe they differ. Titon says that you can use both languages spontaneously. For example, to start speaking Spanish and turn to speak in English. Okay, next we can find that what is bilingualism based on Mackey 1962, that it's very connected uh, with the idea with some of these authors' ideas because he mentions that bilingualism is the ability of using two languages alternately. So in this case, it can be like compared with the idea of Titon that says that you can that is the a bilingual person has the ability to communicate in any of both languages spontaneously. It's basically how a person can communicate the same idea in both languages and can manage uh, these two languages in a very good and developed way. But McKay also mentions that the point at which a person actually becomes bilingual is arbitrary or impossible to determine. Why? Because connected with these other ideas from Baker, he also thought that a person or defining who is bilingual or when a person becomes bilingual, it's almost impossible in the way that you don't know how this process uh, happens, or you don't know maybe what are the factors that influence on the change. So for that reason, he considers uh, that there are certain aspects to consider and that are involved uh, when defining what is bilingualism. So the first one is degree, that is, how well does the individual know the languages he uses? It is related with the level of use of the language. The second one is interference, that is, how well does the bilingual keep his languages apart? It is related with the idea of if the individual mix or have apart in both languages, of it if that individual use that language for one thing and the other for one scenario and the other language for the other scenario. The alternation, to what extent does he alternate between his languages? It is connected with the idea of uh, using spontaneously both languages without any problem and without any diffi difficulty. And the function, that is, what does he or she use his or her languages for? It's basically, as I mentioned, if a person use, for example, English for studying and Spanish or another language for working. So He considers that these four aspects are involved uh, when a person is defined as a bilingual. Then we can find the types and distinctions of bilingualism that are like the features to consider when defining a person. So dimensions of bilingualism based on Valdez and Figueroa cited in Baker and Singwith 2000. So we can find that one of those dimensions is the age. So at what age it occurred? If it was simultaneously between both languages, or if it was sequentially, or if it was late. The second, it's the ability. If it is incipient, receptive, or productive, it is related with the skills, with the four skills of language. The third one is balance of two languages. So it can be connected with the idea of Mackey with the alternation. So if there is a like a limit where you use where you just use one language for one domain and the other language for the other domain or other scenario. So how much are you developing the four skills into the two languages? The fourth one is development, the development, and it can be a sentence. Second language is developing, recessive, one language is decreasing. So for example, it can be related with the idea of Mackey about interference. Because if you notice is the limitations, and also it has to be with the idea of function. So if you use a one language for more important scenarios than the another one, or how you manage these two languages in order that both of them find the balance. The next one is context, where each language is acquired and used. It is related, for example, if you learn or acquire the first language at home. For example, your first language or your mother tongue is Spanish and your second language is English. So what are those contexts that influence on that development of the languages? And the last one is a elective and circumstantial bilingualism. That is the characteristic of individual who choose to learn a language, for example in the classroom. So it's basically if a person decide to become bilingual. Well, also we can find based on Baker 2001 the next distinctions. For example, individual and societal bilingualism, that could be the first distinctions or types of bilingualism uh, with which he began with. So, and how those types of bilingualism work with each other. The next one is language skills. language competence, language performance, language ability, and language achievement. So if you notice, these are almost like the same dimensions that he mentions in his book in his book written in 2000. And the other one is the four language abilities that where he mentioned that this question, are you bilingual, what ability? So it's related with the development of the four abilities in the same at the same level. So the four abilities are listening, speaking, writing, and reading. So if you are bilingual, are you developing those skills in both languages at the same level? And also we can find Mackey cited in Titon 1966 with these characteristics or with these distinctions to take into account. Number of languages involved. So uh, because he considered that both or more languages, if you manage just two or more languages, you are also considered as a bilingual. So for that reason, he mentions this first characteristic. A type of languages used. So he also mentioned this because he considered that there are like languages that can be considered like very similar as French, Spanish, English, because they came from Latin. So he takes into account this idea or this characteristic. The influence of one language on the other. So it is also related with the idea that I have here about interference. And the degree of perfection, it is related with the idea of the four language abilities mentioned by Baker, and the oscillation that it's related to the idea of alternation, the same. So how do you manage those languages when in the different scenarios? And to finish, uh, I decided like to put what types of bilingual education exist based on Baker 2014. So he mentions that there are different kinds of bilingual education. One of those is dual language schools. And he mentions that the purpose or the idea of these schools are learned through two languages, one period one language and another period the second language. And some of the characteristics of these dual language schools are the two languages have equal status, the school ethos it's bilingual, the two languages are taught as languages, um, the staff tends to be bilingual, and finally, the length of the program is longer. Um, the second one that he mentions is dual bilingual peace schools. So those try to manage like the same idea of the dual language schools, but also his focus, excuse me, is on the attempt of social and cultural change, empowering the powerless by teaching another language. So it's how from the manage of different language, you start recognizing and you start to empower yourself. The next one is the immer- immersion bilingual education. That is, it has the idea of become bilingual and bicultural without loss of achievement. So, and some of its characteristics are it varies depending on age and time, and it is based on the idea that a first language is acquired relatively subconsciously. The next one is are the international schools that are a diverse collection of schools throughout the world. So I know some of their characteristics are parents pay fees for private, selective, and independent education, and one language, uh, more likely English, uh, it's used first, but then it becomes bilingual when a national or international language is included. So in order to conclude with this presentation, I would like to mention that the authors uh, have a similarity when they mention that bilingualism it's very difficult like to set and to establish as a simple concept. On the contrary, they prefer to mention that it is a, a really wide concept or construct that is very difficult uh, to limit. So, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you could understand what I talk about, and see you around.